The parable of the sower is one of 7 such stories in the 13th chapter of Matthew. As different as they can be, they are all parables of the kingdom. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, Jesus tells the crowd on the shore of the lake, like treasure lying buried in a field, like yeast, like a pearl of great price, like a net let down in the sea. He's teaching from the prow of a boat because it's the only place he can find to sit. So many have come to hear him, to learn from him, to touch and be touched by him, that there's no space left in their midst. So he steps into a boat and speaks to them across the water, his figure swaying a little with each lift of the waves, his words as full of life and as hard to hold as a handful of the lake. If the crowds have come for lectures in practical theology, then they're disappointed. What they get instead are more like dreams or poems in which images of God's kingdom are passed before them, as familiar as the crops in their own fields and the loaves in their own kitchens, but with a strange new twist. Jesus seems to be saying that these ordinary things have something important to do with God's purpose for them. That these things they handle every day of their lives are vessels of some sort, illustrations of some truth that seems clear to them one moment and hidden the next. Jesus' parables conceal his meaning even as they reveal it. And some say it was how he stayed out of jail. He could have been arrested for talking heresy and treason, after all, but for talking about seeds and thorns, good and bad, not likely. By speaking in parables, Jesus could get his message across without saying it directly, so that his followers nodded and smiled, while his critics scratched their heads. He speaks in parables, he says, so that only certain kinds of listeners can hear him. Those who listen less with their minds and more with their hearts. The parable of the sower is a familiar one to many of us. The sower casts seed on 4 kinds of ground. First, the packed ground of a footpath, then ground that's full of rocks, then ground that's thick with thorns, and finally, good fertile ground. Depending on where they land, the seeds are eaten by birds or spring up quickly and then wither away, or get choked by thorns, while some of them, roughly a quarter of them, take root in good soil. This parable is acted out in the stage production of Godspell, the good-humored play based on the Gospel according to Matthew. I was a part of this show in college, so I can see it vividly in my mind. Several of us played the seeds, each one meeting a different fate. The seed that was cast on the footpath no sooner hit the ground than the other actors started making crow noises and flapped down to peck her to death. The seed that was cast on the rocky ground came to life with a bang, waving his arms around and dancing in place. But then another actor, carrying a big yellow cardboard sun, stood over him until he grew limp and crumpled to the stage. The seed that was cast among thorns barely had time to get to his knees before he was surrounded by prickly-looking characters who got their hands around his neck and choked him. He was a ham, of course, who made a lot of noise and took a long time biting the dust. But finally, he too was dead. Then there was the seed that was cast on good soil, who gracefully came to life and stayed alive, bowing as both the audience and her fellow actors gave her a huge round of applause. Years later, when I would get to reflecting on the parable, I started worrying about what kind of ground I was I was on with God. I started worrying about how many birds were in my field, how many rocks, how many thorns. I started worrying about how I could clean them all up, how I could turn myself into a well-tilled, well-weeded, well-fertilized field for the sowing of God's word. I started worrying about how the odds were 3-1 against me. Those are the odds in the parable, after all. And I began thinking about how I could beat the odds, or at least improve on them by cleaning up my act. That's my usual response to this parable. I hear it as a challenge to be different, as a call to improve my life, so that if the same parable were ever told about me, it would have a happier ending, with all of the seed falling on rich, fertile soil. But there's something wrong with that reading of the parable, because if that's what it is about, then it should be called the parable of the different kinds of ground. Instead, it's been known for centuries as the parable of the sower, which means there is a chance, just a chance, that we've got it all backwards. We hear the story and think it's about us. But what if we're wrong? What if it's really about the sower? What if it's not about our own successes and failures and birds and rocks and thorns? What if it's about the extravagance of a sower who doesn't seem fazed by those concerns? What if it's about someone who flings seed everywhere, wastes it with holy abandon, who feeds the birds, whistles at the rocks, picks his way through the thorns, shouts hallelujah at the good soil, and just keeps on sowing, confident that there is enough seed to go around, and that when the harvest comes, at last, it will fill every barn around to the rafters. If we were in charge, we'd devise a more efficient operation, of course, a neater, cleaner, more productive one that didn't waste seed on birds and rocks and thorns, but concentrated on the good soil and what we could make it do. But I have to agree with Barbara Brown Taylor when she says that Jesus seems to be suggesting that there is another way to go here, a way that is less concerned with productivity and more concerned with plenitude. When COVID-19 is over and we can all travel freely again, there's a little town in the mountains of northwest Georgia I'd like to recommend to all of you. It's called Pennville. There's a place there called Paradise Garden. It was created by Reverend Howard Finster, who became famous as a religious folk artist. He produced over 46,900 pieces of art before his death in 2001. He painted on anything: plywood, broken mirrors, knee-high soda bottles, canned ham tins, old refrigerators, mailboxes, Delta airline plates, high-top sneakers, and even an old Cadillac rusting in his garage. Finster started out as a Baptist preacher and served 8 or 9 churches in rural Georgia and Alabama before he became disillusioned in the early 1970s. After preaching 4,625 sermons, by his count, After presiding at more than 400 funerals and 200 weddings, he conducted a survey at his church and found out that no one remembered anything he said. So he retired from preaching and began fixing things instead. Televisions and bicycles mainly, until 1976, when an inner voice told him to paint. He had dipped his finger in white paint and saw a perfect human face on the ball of his finger. He said, and while I was looking at it, a warm flash kind of went all over me, all the way down, and it said, paint sacred art. And I said to it, I can't do that. I know professionals can, but not me. And it comes to me again, and it says, how do you know? How do you know? I said, how do I know that I can't paint? I took $1 out of my wallet and I pasted it on a piece of plyboard and went out in front of my shop, and I started drawing George Washington off that dollar bill. And his career as an artist began. Finster designed record album covers for rock groups like REM and Talking Heads, later earning him Record Album Cover of the Year by Rolling Stone magazine. He was a larger-than-life personality with a devoted following long before he appeared on the Johnny Carson show or in music videos. He's been called both the grandfather of Southern folk art and the Andy Warhol of the South. For his speaking engagements, he wore a powder blue suit and had his banjo at the ready. He sang with a melodious twang and he could yodel with force. But it was his compelling sermons in paint that made him a folk art phenomenon. His art is both beautiful and bizarre. When you follow the walkways at Paradise Garden, you'll see that they're embedded with old watches, gears, jewelry, marbles, pottery shards. You can't miss the 20-foot tower fashioned from old bicycles, crowned with a cross made out of 2 lawnmower handles, or the 2-ton concrete shoe, or the pump house made entirely from Coca-Cola bottles. There's an aquarium that holds the bones of a 3-legged chicken, a shed full of old sewing machines, and a 6-foot mound of serpents sculpted from poured cement. There are bubblegum machines, bunk bed springs, empty picture frames, and flights of stairs that lead nowhere. You might think nature would be offended by such a display, but it isn't. The whole garden is covered by a canopy of muscadine vines heavy with ripening fruit. There are blueberry bushes and blackberry vines and daylilies blooming among the clutter. There are hens laying eggs, bees making honey, and tadpoles turning into frogs. It is quite simply, as one visitor described it, the most gorgeous pile of garbage I have ever seen. Paradise Garden now has a foundation that supports an arts education for children of the local county, an artist in residence, and promotes cultural awareness all through the region. There is a hand-painted sign on Finster's front porch there that sums up his life and faith. It says, I took the pieces you threw away and put them together night and day. washed by rain, dried by sun, 1,000,000 pieces, all in one. Now, knowing me, I ponder Howard's garden, and I want to weed, neaten, and organize it. I wish I could ask him what everything means and post helpful signs for those who come there after me. But he beat me to it when he posted one that reads, "I built this park of broken pieces to mend a broken world." "What I do talks," he said in an interview near the end of his life. "I figure when I'm deceased, my work will be talking same as if I was here." Jesus used things that was familiar to people to get the subject over to them. God's message is getting around. Once upon a time, a sower went out to sow. And as she sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came along and devoured them. So she put her seed pouch down and spent the next hour stringing aluminum foil all around her field. She put up a fake owl she ordered on Amazon, and as an afterthought, she hung a couple of traps for the Japanese beetles. Then she returned to the sowing. But she noticed some of the seeds were falling on rocky ground. So she put her seed pouch down again and went to fetch her wheelbarrow and shovel. A couple of hours later, she had dug up the rocks and was trying to think of something useful she could do with them when she remembered her sowing and got back to it. But as soon as she did, she ran right into a briar patch that was sure to strangle her little seedlings. So she put her pouch down again and looked everywhere for the weed poison, but finally decided just to pull the thorns up by hand, which meant that she had to go back inside and look everywhere for her gloves. Now, by the time she had the briars cleared, it was getting dark. So the sower picked up her pouch and tools and decided to call it a day. That night, she fell asleep in her chair, looking up the best places to buy seeds online. When she woke up in the morning, she walked out into her field and found a big crow sitting on her fake owl. She found rocks she hadn't found the day before, and she found new little leaves on the roots of the briars that had broken off in her hands. The sower considered all of this, pushing her cap back on her head, and then she did a strange thing. She began to laugh. Just a chuckle at first, and then a full-fledged guffaw that turned into a wheeze at the end when her wind ran out. Still laughing and wheezing, she went after her seed pouch and began flinging seeds everywhere, into the roots of the trees, onto the roof of her house, across all the fences and into her neighbors' fields. She shook seeds at her cows and offered a handful to the dog. She even tossed a fistful into the creek, thinking they might take root downstream somewhere. The more she sowed, the more she seemed to have. None of it made any sense to her, but for once, that didn't seem to matter. And when she was done, she had to admit to herself that she'd never been happier in her life. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears. This is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields. Let those of us who have ears to hear Let us hear, understand, and bear God's fruit everywhere. Let us bear God's fruit everywhere, this day and all our days. Thanks be to God. Amen.